We were discussing monetary policy effectiveness. We first looked at monetary policy effectiveness in SOPA Fires curve. We now want to look at monetary policy effectiveness in SOPA Fettim curve. Here, recall when we talk about an effective policy, we're talking about effectiveness in terms of influencing output. When effective policy is one that results in a larger output response for a given change. So we will now compare the effects of expansionary monetary policy on output when LM curve is steep as in panel B and when it is flat as in panel A. In each case, the expansionary monetary policy, as we can see, shifts the LM curve to the right from LM to LM prime. The slope of the IS curve is the same in both graphs as we want to now compare monetary policy effectiveness under steep versus flat LM curve. We've already discussed monetary policy effectiveness in slope of IS curve. The size of the shift in LM curve is also the same. Now, what's the conclusion that we can draw based on this figure? As the figure shows, the effect on output of an expansionary monetary policy is larger when the LM curve is relatively steep, as in panel when LM curve is relatively steep, as in panel B, and smaller when the LM curve is relatively flat in panel A. This is the conclusion that we can draw from this figure that monetary policy is more effective with a relatively steep LM curve. Now let's try to understand behind it. For this, we need to recall that we have already discussed what factors influence the slope of the LM curve. So here, the steep LM curve reflects either a low interest responsiveness of money demand or a large income responsiveness of money demand or both. The reasons why a steep LM curve reflects this have already been discussed in an earlier video. So now let's try to understand why does this low interest responsiveness of money demand or large income responsiveness of money demand lead to monetary policy being like being more effective. So, as we already discussed when we were looking at effectiveness of monetary policy and slope of IS curve, the effectiveness of monetary policy depends upon factors which influence the strength of the monetary transmission mechanism through which monetary policy works. Let's go back to the monetary transmission mechanism, right? So this was over here. So the monetary transmission mechanism says that money supply changes, that changes interest rate, which changes investment, which changes demand, which influences output, right? Here we can see we already discussed when you're looking at slope of IS curve, the interest sensitivity of investment and multiplier. Now here we can see, like we said, the effectiveness of monetary policy depends upon factors which influence the strength of the monetary transmission mechanism. And as we can see here, one of the factors is going to be the interest responsiveness of money demand, which influences the link between change in money supply and change in interest rate. And like we said, interest responsiveness of money demand influences the slope of the LM curve, right? And it is one of those factors that basically influence the strength of the monetary transmission mechanism through this link between change in M and change in R. So if we go back, so like we said, effectiveness of monetary policy depends upon factors which influence the strength of monetary transmission mechanism, which includes the interest sensitivity of money demand, which is responsible for the steep LM curve, right? Because we know when money supply increases, interest rate must fall to restore money market equilibrium, because then the fall in interest rate would increase money demand to match the new higher money supply. But the question arises with how much must the interest rate change to keep the money market equilibrium after money supply increases? Now, if money demand is relatively insensitive to interest rate, we have a low interest responsiveness of money demand, then a given increase in the money supply requires a relatively large decrease in the interest rate to increase money demand. When money demand is not very sensitive to interest rate, so you will need interest rates to fall by a lot in order to increase money demand enough that it's equal to the new higher money supply. And the larger the decrease in interest rate, the greater will be the effect on investment and therefore an aggregate demand and output, right? If we go back to our monetary transmission mechanism channel, like we said, if interest responsiveness of money demand is low, then the change in money supply would require a larger change in interest rate. Interest rates need to fall by a lot to increase money demand enough so that it's equal to the new higher money supply, right? Because demand is not very sensitive to interest rates, so it requires a larger drop in R to increase money demand sufficiently. And then that larger drop in R will result in a larger increase in investment, which will result in a larger increase in output rate. Right, so basically the link between change in money supply and change in R in the monetary transmission mechanism is strong. So if money demand is relatively interest sensitive to changes in interest rate, then LM is steeper and monetary policy is more effective. The figure showed us that when we have a steeper LM curve, monetary policy is more effective. We understood the economic intuition behind it. The economic intuition is that the steep LM curve reflects low interest responsiveness of money demand, which increases the strength of the monetary transmission mechanism. So to summarize, the impact of a given monetary policy stimulus on output is larger if either the IS curve is relatively flat and or the LM curve is relatively steep, because this implies a stronger monetary transmission mechanism through which monetary policy works. A key thing to remember here is that whenever we want to discuss the effectiveness of monetary policy, and we're talking about, yes, it depends upon slope of IS and LM curve, which in turn depends upon different parameters. And when you're trying to explain the economic intuition behind them, you're trying to look at how do these parameters affect the strength of the monetary transmission mechanism through which monetary policy works. And for this, keep in mind this mechanism, right? Money supply changes, interest rate changes, that changes investment, which changes demand. What influences this link between change in money supply and change in interest rate is interest responsiveness of money demand. What influences this link, change in interest rate, change in investment, is interest responsiveness of investment. What influences this link, change in investment and change in output, is multiplier, right?